frail elderly woman, her hands quivering as she clutched a paper bag filled with important documents. Never imagined that her routine trip to Ridgeway Savings Bank would unravel into a humiliating ordeal. After more than 3 decades of loyal service to the bank, she found herself cast aside, simply because she didn't own a smartphone. The disdainful stares from the staff and customers around her made her feel like the world itself was turning against her. Just as despair began to overwhelm her, a stranger stepped in to change everything. That stranger? None other than former NBA star and philanthropist Marcus O'Connor. His unexpected intervention would shine a light on the importance of compassion in a world increasingly driven by technology and bureaucracy. Follow this inspiring journey, and if this story touches your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more uplifting content. Don't forget to share where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Doris Wellington slowly pushed open the heavy glass doors of Ridgeway Savings Bank. The cold light from the fluorescent ceiling panels glinted off the polished marble floor, creating an unwelcoming ambiance. Doris paused for a moment, her breath hitching as she steadied herself. This place had once been a regular stop for her, so familiar it felt like an extension of her home. But today, it felt alien, even hostile. Wearing her threadbare wool coat, the one she'd owned for decades, Doris gripped her worn fabric bag tightly as she shuffled forward. Inside the bag were papers she hoped would be enough: a well-used savings book, utility bills, her late husband's veteran service certificate, and even a letter from the bank itself sent just a few months ago. These items, remnants of a lifetime of careful planning and frugality, were now her only defense. Her mind wandered briefly to Ernest, her husband of 45 years, who was waiting at home. Ernest's health had deteriorated significantly over the past few months. Earlier that day, the doctor had updated his treatment plan, prescribing a new medication that would cost $480. Milligan's pharmacy, the only place that carried the medicine, would close by 5 p.m. Doris had no time to waste. Ernest needed that medication tonight. The familiar determination that had seen her through decades of hardship faltered slightly under the weight of her circumstances. Her old flip phone, tucked into her coat pocket, was of no use here. It could only make calls and send texts, perfectly adequate for her simple needs, until today. Now it felt like a relic of an era that no longer cared for people like her. She approached the teller counter. Behind it, a young woman in a crisp uniform sat, wireless earbuds nestled in her ears as her fingers danced across the keyboard of her computer. Doris hesitated, then cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice small but polite. "I'd like to withdraw some money from my savings account." The teller glanced up briefly, her expression indifferent. "Have you set up our mobile banking app?" she asked in a clipped tone. Doris blinked, confused. "No, I don't have a smartphone," she said gently, reaching into her bag and placing her savings book on the counter. "But I have all my documents here." The teller raised her eyebrows slightly, as though incredulous. Adjusting her thin-rimmed glasses, she gave Doris a cursory glance before replying. "I'm sorry, but your account hasn't been digitally verified. That's a new policy. Without verification through our app, I can't process any transactions." Doris felt the words hit her like a blow. "But what policy?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I've been banking here for over 30 years. I have everything you need: my savings book, bills, my husband's documents. Please, I just need to withdraw money for his medicine." The teller sighed audibly, her expression softening only slightly. "I understand, ma'am, but it's a new regulation implemented after the bank merged with Horizon Financial. We can't make exceptions." Doris's heart sank. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "My husband's at home. He's very sick. I just need a little money to get his medication." The teller hesitated, glancing at Doris with a faint look of discomfort, but instead of helping, she pressed a button on her desk. Moments later, a security guard approached. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you're disrupting other customers." "Please step outside," the guard said firmly, but not unkindly. Tears blurred Doris's vision as she clumsily tried to gather her papers. Her trembling hands caused them to scatter on the cold marble floor. Utility bills, her husband's veteran certificate, and even an old photograph of her and Ernest from years ago. The humiliation was unbearable. As she bent to retrieve her belongings, the other customers watched in silence. Some whispered among themselves, clearly uncomfortable, but no one moved to help. Doris's legs felt weak as the guard helped her to her feet and gently escorted her to the exit. Outside, she sank onto a bench, her frail hands clutching her documents as tears rolled down her cheeks. How could this happen to her? She had lived her life honestly, paid her dues, and been nothing but loyal. Now, when she needed help the most, she felt abandoned. Not just by the bank, but by the world around her. Doris Wellington clutched the edge of the counter, her voice trembling but insistent. "This is my money," she pleaded, her eyes welling with tears. "Please, I just need to withdraw enough to buy my husband's medicine. He's at home waiting for me." The young bank employee, Marissa, glanced at Doris with a hint of feigned sympathy. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," she said, her tone clipped and detached, "but policy is policy. Without verification through the Ridgeway app, I can't process your request." Doris's hands, clutching the documents she had painstakingly prepared, began to shake. "Please," she tried again, her voice breaking. "My husband needs this medicine. He's unwell. He can't wait." Marissa hesitated briefly, looking uncomfortable but unmoved. Then, with a quick motion, she pressed the intercom button. "Security," she said flatly, "we need assistance at the front desk." Two security guards emerged moments later. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter but equally firm in demeanor. The taller guard spoke first, his voice calm but unyielding. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." Doris felt her knees weaken, her breath catching in her chest. She bent to collect her papers, but her trembling hands betrayed her. The documents slipped from her grasp, scattering across the marble floor like fallen leaves. Among them was the prescription for Ernest's medication, the tattered veteran's certificate, and a cherished photo of them from years past. A few of the bank's customers paused, noticing the scene. An elderly woman whispered to her companion, "This is outrageous. How can they treat her like this?" But no one stepped forward to help. The shorter guard reluctantly bent down, picking up some of Doris's papers before handing them back to her. "Please leave, ma'am," he repeated, his tone slightly gentler, but still firm. Unable to form a response, Doris clutched her crumpled documents to her chest and stumbled out of the bank. The harsh afternoon sunlight hit her tear-streaked face, stinging her red eyes. She collapsed onto a nearby bench, her frail hands trembling as she tried to organize the scattered papers. The prescription, an electric bill, and the old photograph of her and Ernest lay in a messy pile before her. She picked up the photo, her watery eyes lingering on the image. In it, Ernest stood tall and proud in his military uniform, a young man full of strength and determination. Beside him, a younger version of herself smiled with hope and optimism for the future. They had weathered countless storms together, raising children, building a life, facing hardships, but now she felt powerless to protect the man who had always been her rock. "How did it come to this?" Doris whispered, her voice cracking as she fought back tears. Her old cloth bag sat beside her, the faded material sagging under its weight. Inside, the flip phone lay silent and useless, a relic of a simpler time that now seemed like a cruel joke. Back inside the bank, murmurs began to ripple through the room. A middle-aged man in line shook his head, muttering to the person beside him, "She's been a customer here her whole life. This is disgraceful." The other customer nodded in agreement. They should be helping her, not throwing her out like that. But the discontent remained confined to whispers, and no one acted. Doris sat alone on the bench, the sunlight casting long shadows over her fragile frame. Her red, swollen eyes watched as a light breeze began to pick up, rustling the papers around her feet. One particularly strong gust caught hold of Ernest's prescription, sending it skittering a few feet away. "No," she gasped, leaning forward in an attempt to retrieve it. Her weak, trembling hands struggled to grasp the paper. As she stretched further, she lost her balance, gripping the edge of the bench to steady herself. Her shoulders sagged in defeat, the prescription just out of reach. She let out a shaky sigh, her energy drained by the relentless cycle of humiliation and despair. She picked up the photo of Ernest once more, holding it tightly as if it could somehow provide strength. In her memories, Ernest had always been a source of unwavering support. Even in his current frail state, ravaged by illness, he remained her anchor. But now the roles had reversed, and she felt utterly incapable of rising to the occasion. "What am I going to do?" Doris whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling of the wind. Tears began to fall again, hot and unrelenting. "Ernest needs me. He's always been there for me. Now I can't even do this for him." Her grip on the old bag tightened, as though seeking comfort in its familiar texture. But no amount of reassurance could quiet the storm of helplessness in her heart. Inside the bank, the subdued whispers grew louder as more customers noticed Doris sitting outside. Still, none of them stepped out to assist. The middle-aged man who had spoken earlier shook his head again, his annoyance palpable. "She deserves better than this." Outside, Doris remained seated, her head bowed. Her thoughts spiraled around one question that repeated itself over and over, each time louder than the last. "What can I do to save him?" Doris Wellington sat motionless on the bench, her frail frame hunched as the weight of the day bore down on her. The humiliation she had endured at Ridgeway Savings Bank clung to her like a shadow, sharp and unforgiving. For someone who had lived a life of integrity, hard work, and resilience, the experience felt like a betrayal. The place she had trusted for over 3 decades had dismissed her like an inconvenience, shattering her sense of dignity. Inside the bank, business continued as usual. Customers moved between counters, employees called out numbers, and the faint hum of quiet conversations filled the space. But beneath the routine, a current of discontent rippled among those who had witnessed Doris's expulsion. A middle-aged man waiting in line shook his head in frustration. "This is unacceptable," he muttered to the woman beside him. "She's been a customer here her entire life, and they treat her like that?" The woman nodded, her face a mix of anger and sympathy. They should be helping her, not throwing her out. Yet, despite the murmurs of agreement, no one stepped forward to act. The dissatisfaction lingered like a whisper in the air, quiet and ineffective. Outside, a sleek black SUV pulled into the bank's parking lot, its polished surface gleaming under the afternoon sun. The driver's door opened and a tall, commanding figure emerged. Tyrell Harris, a retired basketball legend renowned not just for his towering presence on the court but also for his dedication to charitable work. Tyrell exuded an air of confidence tempered with humility. His teenage daughter, Amara, hopped out of the passenger seat, her curious eyes scanning the surroundings. "Dad," Amara whispered, tugging at Tyrell's sleeve. She pointed toward the bench where Doris sat, her frail shoulders trembling. "That woman, something's wrong." Tyrell followed his daughter's gaze. He saw Doris hunched over, her thin hands struggling to gather the papers scattered around her feet. Her face was marked with anguish, her reddened eyes revealing the depth of her despair. Without a word, Tyrell began walking toward Doris. His broad shadow stretched across the pavement, prompting her to glance up. Startled by the stranger's approach, she instinctively wiped at her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands betraying her emotional state. "Are you all right?" Tyrell asked, his deep voice warm and steady, offering an unexpected kindness that belied his imposing stature. Doris hesitated, unsure of who this man was or why he cared. After a moment, she managed to stammer, I just wanted to withdraw some money to buy medicine for my husband. But they wouldn't let me. They said I need a smartphone." Tyrell knelt down to help her collect the scattered papers. Among them was a crumpled prescription, a utility bill, and a faded photograph. As he picked up the photo, his expression softened. It was a picture of Doris and her husband Ernest in their younger years. Ernest stood proudly in his military uniform, his arm around Doris, who beamed with youthful optimism. "How long have you been banking here?" Tyrell asked, his voice steady but laden with meaning. Doris clutched her bag tightly, her voice trembling. "Over 30 years, she said. Never had a problem before, but now." Her words faltered as tears welled up in her eyes again. Amara, who had been quietly observing, knelt beside her father to pick up the photograph. She studied it thoughtfully before handing it to him. "Dad," she said softly, "she spent her whole life giving. They can't treat her like this." Tyrell nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. He handed the photo back to Doris and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry," he said firmly. "We'll go back to the bank and sort this out." Doris looked up at him, her tear-streaked face a mix of hope and uncertainty. "But they already threw me out," she whispered, the humiliation still fresh in her mind. I don't want to cause more trouble. Tyrell's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. Sometimes, he said, people need to be reminded that they're dealing with a person, not just a policy. His words carried a quiet strength that eased some of Doris's fears. Though she still felt hesitant, the sincerity in Tyrell's voice made her believe, if only for a moment, that she wasn't alone in this fight. Amara gently took Doris's hand and smiled. You've done so much for others. Let us help you now. With Tyrell's towering presence and Amara's compassionate encouragement, Doris found the courage to stand. Together, they began walking back toward the bank, the daunting glass doors reflecting the afternoon light. This time, Doris didn't feel quite so small. Doris, her tear-filled eyes brimming with gratitude, could only nod. Together with Tyrell and his daughter, Amara, she walked toward the glass doors of Ridgeway Savings Bank. Just minutes earlier, she had left those very doors feeling humiliated and powerless. But this time, she was not alone. Beside her stood Tyrell, a towering figure with an even larger heart, radiating confidence and quiet determination. Doris entered the bank again, her steps hesitant but steadied by Tyrell's presence. The cold, indifferent atmosphere seemed to shift the moment they stepped inside. Amara, walking beside her father, discreetly recorded the scene on her phone, capturing every detail. As soon as they entered, whispers began to ripple through the room. Customers stopped mid-conversation, some nudging each other and pointing discreetly. A few quickly pulled out their phones, capturing the unfolding moment. The usual buzz of transactions slowed, and the room grew tense. Doris kept her head bowed, unused to this sudden attention. But as she glanced up, she saw familiar faces among the crowd, older customers who had known her for years. Some had been her neighbors, others colleagues from the past. A few nodded toward her, their expressions filled with sympathy and quiet encouragement. Their silent support gave Doris a flicker of courage, enough to straighten her posture just slightly. Tyrell led Doris directly to the teller counter, where she had been turned away earlier. The young teller, Marissa, immediately froze upon seeing them approach. She recognized Doris, but it was Tyrell's imposing presence that made her sit up straighter in her chair. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, her usual confidence visibly shaken. Tyrell stopped in front of the counter, his towering frame casting a shadow over the desk. In a deep, steady voice that carried across the bank, he said, "Mrs. Wellington needs to withdraw money from her account." Why was she refused? Marissa's hands trembled slightly as she tried to maintain her composure. "Sir, it's because of the bank's policy," she stammered, her voice faltering. "We require all accounts to be verified through the Ridgeway app. This is a new regulation, and there are no exceptions." Tyrell lightly tapped the counter with his fingers, the sound sharp and deliberate. The room, already silent, seemed to grow even quieter. He leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but authoritative. "No exceptions? Tell me, what kind of policy would deny an elderly woman, a loyal customer of over 30 years, access to her own money, especially when it's a matter of life and death?" Marissa didn't respond immediately. Her fingers nervously tapped at the keyboard, pretending to be busy, but it was clear she was searching for a way out of the situation. Her eyes darted toward the glass-walled office in the corner of the room. Noticing her glance, Tyrell turned slightly. From the office stepped a woman in a tailored gray business suit, her face composed but visibly concerned. Rebecca Mullins, the branch manager, moved toward them, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. In her early 30s, Rebecca carried an air of authority, but there was a flicker of unease in her expression as she approached. Rebecca's sharp eyes quickly took in the scene, the elderly woman clutching her documents, the imposing figure of Tyrell Harris, and the phones held discreetly by customers capturing every word. For a moment, her gaze lingered on the tattered papers in Doris's hands, and her expression softened slightly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harris," Rebecca said, addressing Tyrell directly. She extended a hand, her voice professional but strained. "I'm Rebecca Mullins, the manager of this branch. How can I assist you today?" Tyrell didn't shake her hand immediately. Instead, he turned to Doris, gesturing toward her with a subtle motion. "She doesn't need my help," he said, his voice steady but pointed. "What she needs is help from your bank. I'd like to know why Mrs. Wellington was kicked out." when all she wanted was to withdraw her own money. Rebecca's eyes flickered toward Doris again, and for a moment she looked as though she was searching for the right words. Around them, the customers' attention remained fixed, their curiosity and frustration palpable. A few whispered among themselves, their discontent growing louder. Rebecca took a deep breath, regaining her composure. "Mr. Harris, I understand this must have been upsetting for Mrs. Stainett Wellington," she began carefully. "However, our bank recently implemented a policy requiring digital verification for all accounts. This is to ensure the security of our customers and to comply with the latest financial regulations." Terrell's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture remaining firm. "Security? Is that what you're calling it? Because to me, it looks like a system designed to exclude people who don't fit your definition of modern. She's been banking here for decades without a problem, and now you've made her feel like she doesn't belong." Rebecca hesitated, clearly torn. She glanced at the growing crowd of onlookers, her professional demeanor beginning to crack under the weight of their silent judgment. The whispers grew louder, and someone muttered, "He's right." Before Rebecca could respond, Tyrell added, his voice calm but resolute, "Policies are meant to serve people, not to humiliate them. If this is how your bank treats its most loyal customers, maybe it's time to rethink those policies." Rebecca Mullins felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. The quiet murmurs and the smartphones discreetly filming Tyrell Harris's confrontation with her were amplifying the tension. She took a steadying breath, her professional demeanor faltering under the pressure. "Mr. Harris," Rebecca began, her tone measured but strained, "I'm very sorry about this situation. However, our bank has recently implemented new security policies. All accounts must now be verified through our Ridgeway banking app. This change is to ensure customer safety and to prevent fraudulent activities. According to these regulations, we cannot process any transactions for accounts that have not been verified. This is a standard policy, and I have no authority to override it." Terrell narrowed his eyes, his imposing presence growing even more commanding. He straightened his posture, and though his voice lowered, each word carried undeniable weight. "Do you even understand who she is? She's not just a customer, she's a part of this community. Doris Wellington has been coming to this bank every month for over 30 years without a single issue. And now, just because she doesn't have a smartphone, you're denying her access to her own money? That's not security. It's cruelty." Rebecca swallowed hard. She shifted her gaze toward Doris, who stood quietly beside Tyrell, clutching her documents tightly, her face etched with both hope and fear. Rebecca knew Tyrell's words were true, but the warnings from her superiors rang loudly in her mind. Do not violate the regulations. The consequences will be severe. Tyrell took a deliberate step closer, his calm voice gaining an edge of determination that made Rebecca instinctively step back. "Policies are supposed to serve people, not hurt them," he said. "If you refuse to help her today, I will personally make sure she transfers every last dollar out of this bank. And I guarantee this story will go viral. Is that what you want?" The air in the bank seemed to freeze. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked on Rebecca. The murmurs of customers had grown louder, and one woman, standing near the teller line, called out, "Help her, it's the right thing to do." Rebecca glanced at the wall clock. It was 4:50 p.m., just 10 minutes before Milligan's pharmacy would close. The urgency of the situation pressed against her, and the judgmental stares from the crowd only heightened her discomfort. Finally, she let out a long sigh, as though resigning herself to a difficult choice. "All right," Rebecca said quietly, her voice steady but subdued. "We'll make an exception. I'll take responsibility for this." Doris blinked in disbelief, her tired eyes widening with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you so much. My husband needs this medicine. He can't wait." Rebecca nodded curtly, signaling for Marissa, the young teller, to process the transaction. As the teller complied, Rebecca's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the tension in her jaw remained visible. Meanwhile, Tyrell stood silently beside Doris, his steady presence a source of reassurance. When the cash was finally handed to Doris, she held the envelope as though it were her lifeline. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not tears of shame or despair this time, but tears of immense relief and gratitude. Turning to Tyrell, she struggled to find words, her voice quivering. "Thank you," she said, her words barely audible. "Thank you so much. You're a good man." Tyrell crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his tone gentle but firm. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Take care of your husband. You've done everything for him, and that's what truly matters." As Doris exited the bank, the surrounding customers broke into spontaneous applause. The sound was soft at first, then grew stronger, filling the room with an unspoken solidarity. Amara continued filming, capturing the heartfelt moment as Doris stepped into the warm afternoon sunlight, clutching the envelope tightly as if it were her entire world. Doris turned back toward the glass doors of the bank, her tear-streaked face glowing with gratitude. Tyrell and Amara stood there, their concerned eyes following her. Doris gave them a small, shaky nod of thanks, her lips trembling as she tried to smile. Tyrell waved to her, a reassuring smile crossing his face, while Amara gave a thumbs up, her youthful enthusiasm shining through. "That's how you treat people," Tyrell said softly, turning to Rebecca. He extended a hand to her, his expression calm but resolute. "Thank you for making the right decision. But remember, policies should serve people, not the other way around." Rebecca hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. A small, almost reluctant smile broke through her professional mask. "You're right," she admitted. "I'll remember that." Doris walked away feeling a weight lifted from her shoulders, lighter than she had felt in days. The kindness and determination of a stranger had not only restored her dignity, but had also reminded her that compassion still existed in the world. For those who witnessed the moment, it was more than just an act of generosity. It was a powerful reminder of what it meant to stand up for what was right and the difference that a single act of kindness could make. Amara turned to her father, her eyes shining with excitement as they walked back to their SUV. "Dad, we really made a difference today," she said, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. "I'm so glad we helped her." Tyrell Harris smiled gently, placing a large hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Sweetheart, sometimes the smallest actions can make the biggest difference," he replied, his voice calm and full of warmth. "But remember, we didn't do this for recognition. We did it to remind people that compassion still has a place in this world." Amara nodded, clutching her phone tightly. "Dad, I think this story needs to be shared. It could be a lesson for so many people." Tyrell's expression softened as he looked at her. "If you share it," he said firmly, "make sure it doesn't stop at just a story. Let it inspire people to prioritize kindness over rules." Meanwhile, Doris Wellington stood at the curb and quickly hailed a passing taxi. As the car pulled over, she leaned into the open window and said urgently, "Please, take me to Milligan's Pharmacy on Main Street. My husband needs his medicine right away." The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind smile, nodded. "Don't worry, ma'am. I'll get you there as fast as I can," he assured her. Doris sank into the back seat, clutching the envelope of money in her hands as though her life depended on it. The events of the day replayed in her mind, each moment of humiliation and despair now eclipsed by a glimmer of hope. She glanced out the window as the taxi sped through the streets, unaware that the driver's urgency was helping save her husband's life. When the taxi pulled up outside the pharmacy, Doris stepped out, her legs still trembling slightly from everything she had endured. She hurried inside, her worn shoes clicking against the tiled floor. The clerk at the counter looked up and immediately recognized her. "Mrs. Wellington," he exclaimed, "we've got the prescription ready for your husband. I'm glad you made it before we closed." Doris's hands shook as she reached for the small paper bag containing the life-saving medicine. Relief washed over her as she held it close to her chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Today has been difficult, but I finally have what I need to take care of him." The clerk smiled kindly as she paid and left the store. When Doris arrived home, she opened the door to find Ernest sitting in his usual chair by the window, his gaze fixed on the doorway as though waiting for her. Though his body had grown weaker from his illness, his gentle smile still carried the same warmth it always had. "I'm home," Doris said softly, stepping inside. Ernest's voice was hoarse but filled with love. "I knew you'd come through," he said, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. Doris walked quickly to his side, knelt down, and placed the small bag of medicine in his lap. "I got it," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Everything's okay now, Ernest. We'll get through this." Ernest reached out and gently took her hand. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you. Thank you." Doris smiled through her tears, resting her hand on his. "We've faced so much together, haven't we? This is no different," she said softly. The two of them sat there, surrounded by the quiet familiarity of their small home. Though the day had been filled with challenges, Doris felt a profound sense of relief, not just because she had succeeded in getting the medicine, but because she knew she wasn't alone. Tyrell and Amara had given her hope when she needed it most, a light in the darkness that had seemed all-consuming. The next day, the story of Doris and Tyrell began to spread across social media. Amara uploaded the video she had recorded at the bank, pairing it with a thoughtful caption. "Sometimes, heartless rules need to be challenged with compassion. Today, I learned that one small act can change someone's entire life." The video quickly went viral, attracting millions of views and countless comments. Messages of support poured in for Doris and praise for Tyrell's actions. Tyrell Harris isn't just a basketball legend, he's a hero in real life. This bank needs to reevaluate its priorities. People over policies, always. Reminds me of my own grandmother. Thank you for standing up for people like her. The overwhelming community response put Ridgeway Savings Bank under intense scrutiny. Within days, the bank's leadership called an emergency meeting to address the backlash. Rebecca Mullins, the branch manager, attended the meeting with a heavy heart, knowing she would be questioned about her decision to make an exception for Doris. When asked to explain her actions, Rebecca spoke candidly. "I know I broke the rules," she admitted, "but I couldn't stand by and watch a loyal customer be denied access to her own money. Policies are important, but they should never come at the expense of humanity. Mrs. Wellington isn't just a customer. She's a part of this community, and I couldn't turn my back on her." For a few moments, no one spoke. The tension was palpable, the leadership team exchanging uncertain glances. Finally, one of the senior executives who had seen the viral video broke the silence. "I think Rebecca made the right call," he said firmly. "This is exactly the time we need to reconsider our approach. If we lose sight of our responsibility to the people we serve, we've lost the very purpose of why this bank exists." The room nodded in agreement, and the decision was made. Ridgeway Savings Bank would overhaul its policies, introducing special support for elderly customers and those unfamiliar with technology. The announcement was shared publicly soon after, emphasizing a renewed commitment to placing people over rigid regulations. A few weeks later, Doris Wellington was surprised by an unexpected knock at her door. When she opened it, her breath caught. Standing before her was Tyrell Harris, the man who had helped her at the bank, accompanied by his daughter Amara. Tyrell held a bag full of groceries in one hand, a bouquet of flowers in the other, and a small card tucked under his arm. "Mr. Harris," Doris exclaimed, her voice a mix of surprise and joy. "What brings you here?" Tyrell smiled warmly, leaning down slightly to meet her gaze. "I just wanted to see how you and your husband are doing," he said gently. "And to thank you for giving me the chance to do the right thing." Behind him, Amara grinned and waved, holding a tray of homemade cookies she had insisted on bringing along. Inside the house, Ernest, though weak, tried to rise from his chair. His frail hands pressed against the armrests as he struggled to his feet. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. "You helped my wife during our darkest time. That means the world to us." Tyrell quickly stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on Ernest's shoulder. "No need to thank me," he said sincerely. "You two are the real heroes here. You've lived your lives for each other, and that's something we can all learn from." Doris stood nearby, her eyes welling up with tears, though her lips stretched into a contented smile. She watched as Tyrell and Ernest exchanged a firm handshake, the stark contrast between them, one towering and strong, the other frail and weary, underscored by mutual respect and admiration. "You didn't just help us get the money," Ernest said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You helped me regain something I thought I'd lost, faith. Faith that kindness still exists in this world." Tyrell crouched slightly to meet Ernest's gaze, clasping his hands firmly. "I was just doing what anyone should do," he replied, his voice filled with empathy. "You and Doris have spent your lives loving and caring for each other. That kind of love deserves all the respect in the world." As the conversation continued, Amara wandered around the cozy home, her eyes lighting up at the little details that made it special. The walls were adorned with family photographs, and a soft morning light streamed through a small window. One photo, in particular, caught her attention: a weathered wooden frame holding an image of Ernest in uniform standing proudly beside a young Doris. They were holding hands, their smiles bright and full of hope, as if the world belonged to them. Amara picked up the photo carefully and turned to Doris. "Mrs. Wellington, you and Mr. Wellington are amazing," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "Your love is so beautiful. I hope I can find something like this one day." Doris chuckled softly, her face lighting up with a warm smile. She placed a gentle hand on Amara's shoulder. "You will, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady and wise. "But remember, true love isn't just about beautiful words. It's about sacrifice, patience, and standing by each other, no matter how tough life gets. That's what makes it real." Amara nodded thoughtfully, her sparkling eyes reflecting the wisdom of Doris's words. "Thank you," she said softly, setting the photo back on the table with care. Before leaving, Tyrell handed Doris the card he had brought with him. She opened it to find a heartfelt message, written in elegant handwriting. "To the two strongest people I've ever met, never forget that you are not alone." The simple yet profound words brought a fresh wave of tears to Doris's eyes. She clasped the card to her chest, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Thank you." As Tyrell and Amara said their goodbyes and walked back to their car, Doris stood by the door, watching them go with a heart full of gratitude. She turned to Ernest, who was now sitting comfortably in his chair, holding the bouquet of flowers with a smile. "Our little house feels so much brighter today," Doris said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's moments like these that remind me there's still so much good in the world." Ernest nodded, his tired eyes gleaming with contentment. "We've had our share of hardships, Doris, but people like Tyrell remind us that we're never truly alone. Kindness has a way of finding us when we need it most." Doris smiled, taking his hand in hers. She knew he was right. Life had taught them that while challenges were inevitable, the compassion of others could light even the darkest days. The next day, the video Amara had filmed at Ridgeway Savings Bank became a sensation on social media. In the clip, Tyrell stood firm in front of the bank manager, passionately but compassionately defending Doris's rights. Amara's thoughtful caption read, "Sometimes, a small action can change an entire life. Technology and regulations should never replace compassion and empathy." The video spread like wildfire, amassing millions of views and hundreds of thousands of shares. Comments flooded in from people across the world. "Tyrell Harris isn't just a basketball legend, he's a real-life hero. This bank needs to learn to put people before policies. What a powerful lesson. This reminds me of my grandmother. Thank you, Tyrell, and thank you, Doris, for reminding us all of the value of kindness." The overwhelming response created immense pressure on Ridgeway Savings Bank. Within days, its leadership convened an emergency meeting to discuss the video's impact and address shortcomings in their customer service policies. Rebecca Mullins, the branch manager who had directly handled Doris's situation, attended the meeting with a heavy heart, fully aware that her decision to bend the rules was under scrutiny. During the meeting, Rebecca stood up, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I know I violated regulations when I handled Mrs. Wellington's transaction," she said. "But I believe that if we don't show flexibility in situations like hers, we lose sight of what matters most. The core mission of this bank is to serve people, not rules. Mrs. Wellington isn't just a customer. She's a member of this community, and I couldn't turn my back on that." Rebecca's words left the room silent. The senior executives exchanged thoughtful glances. Finally, a senior executive who had seen the viral video spoke up. "Rebecca is right," he said. "This video doesn't just hurt our reputation, it's a wake-up call. If customers feel neglected or treated unfairly, we don't just lose their business, we lose the very reason we exist." As a result of the meeting, Ridgeway Savings Bank introduced significant policy changes. A new department was established specifically to support elderly customers and those unfamiliar with technology. The bank also committed to retraining employees to foster empathy and humanity in their service. An official announcement highlighted the bank's renewed focus on putting people over regulations. A few weeks later, Doris received an unexpected letter from the bank. Inside was a handwritten note from Rebecca Mullins, accompanied by a small bouquet of flowers. The letter expressed deep regret for the way Doris had been treated and offered heartfelt thanks for helping the bank recognize what truly matters in its operations. As Doris read the letter, tears streamed down her cheeks. For the first time, she felt not only respected, but also validated. Her story had created ripples far greater than she ever imagined. But there was more. Another letter arrived shortly after, this time from a charity organization founded by Tyrell Harris. The letter announced the establishment of the Wellington Scholarship Fund for Community Resilience and Loyalty, aimed at supporting underprivileged students in Doris and Ernest's neighborhood. The initiative was a testament to the couple's unwavering love and dedication to their community. Doris stared at the letter in disbelief, her voice trembling with emotion as she turned to Ernest. "Do you see this?" she whispered, her hands shaking. "We're just ordinary people, but our story has reached further than I ever thought possible." Ernest reached for her hand, his grip weak but steady. His eyes shone with pride. "Ordinary people," he said softly, "have extraordinary power when they show love and kindness. You've always had that power, Doris." Doris smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with gratitude. She and Ernest may have faced their fair share of challenges, but the love and kindness they had given and received proved that even in the darkest times, there was always light. One sunny morning, Doris and Ernest sat by the window, enjoying a peaceful start to their day. Though Ernest's health remained fragile, his smile had returned, and Doris cherished the sight of it. With her delicate hands, she carefully prepared his tea, ensuring each sip was just right. It was a simple yet joyful moment, the kind they had come to treasure. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, breaking the quiet. Doris stood, looking over at Ernest with a warm smile. "Wait here," she said. "I'll get it." She opened the door, expecting nothing more than the mail or a neighbor stopping by. Instead, her breath caught in her chest. Standing before her were Tyrell and Amara, but they were not alone. Behind them was a group of smiling students in neatly pressed uniforms, each holding colorful signs and a bouquet of flowers. And further back, a gathering of community members had assembled, their faces glowing with admiration. Doris covered her mouth with her hands, trying to contain the flood of emotions welling up inside her. What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tyrell stepped forward, his familiar warm smile lighting up his face. "Mrs. Wellington," he began, his voice steady and kind, "we're here not just to visit you, but to let you know how deeply your story has touched so many people. You and Mr. Wellington have inspired more lives than you can imagine." Amara stepped forward, holding a large sign that read, "Doris and Ernest Wellington, Community Heroes." The words were written in bold, colorful letters, surrounded by drawings of hearts and stars. One of the students, a young boy with bright eyes, approached Doris and handed her a card. The handwriting was shaky but heartfelt. "Thank you for showing us that kindness still exists." Doris's trembling hands accepted the card, and she pressed it to her chest, her tears spilling freely. She looked at the children, her heart swelling with gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Despite his frailty, Ernest had managed to stand and make his way to the door. He leaned on the frame for support, his voice hoarse but filled with emotion. "You've given us more than we ever could have dreamed," he said, addressing Tyrell directly. "Not just medicine, not just help. You've given us faith in ourselves and in this community." Tyrell approached Ernest and took his hand in both of his, shaking it firmly yet gently. "Mr. Wellington," he said, "you and Mrs. Wellington have taught me and everyone here a valuable lesson. Sometimes the quiet strength and sacrifices of a couple can inspire the entire world." The surprises didn't end there. Tyrell turned back to the group and retrieved an envelope from his jacket pocket. He handed it to Doris with a smile. "This is a small gift from the charity we established in your name," he said. Doris opened the envelope with shaking hands, revealing a check that represented the first donation to the Wellington Scholarship Fund for Community Resilience and Kindness. The fund would support educational opportunities for underprivileged children in their community, ensuring that Doris and Ernest's legacy would continue to grow. "It's our way of honoring your story," Tyrell explained. "Your kindness and love have already spread so far, and now they'll keep spreading." For a long moment, Doris stood silently, staring at the check, then at Tyrell, then at the group of students and community members. Finally, her gaze shifted to Ernest, her voice choked with emotion. "Ernest," she said softly, "I never thought that we, two ordinary people, could ever achieve something so incredible." Ernest's grip on her hand tightened, his smile gentle but filled with conviction. "Doris," he replied, "we're not just ordinary people. It's the love we've shared that has paved the way for all of this, and Tyrell helped us spread it." As the group began to leave, Doris and Ernest returned to their chairs by the window, their home now brighter than ever, not just from the sunlight, but from the gifts and laughter that still echoed in the space. Sitting beside Ernest, Doris took his hand in hers. "We've been through so many storms," she said, her voice filled with wonder, "but I don't think I've ever felt prouder than I do today." Ernest looked at her, his eyes glistening with emotion. "That's because today, Doris, we're seeing the best of humanity, and it all started with love." Doris nodded, a peaceful smile spreading across her face as she glanced out at the clear blue sky. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they would face them with hope and resilience, buoyed by the kindness of those who had come into their lives. Doris Wellington placed her hand gently over Ernest's, her gaze filled with gratitude. "We've truly lived a life worth living, Ernest," she said softly. "And do you know what? Even if it's just in a small way, we've helped change the world." Ernest smiled, his eyes gleaming with contentment. His voice, though weak, carried a strength born from years of love and perseverance. "You're right, Doris," he replied, "and it's all thanks to compassion. The compassion Tyrell showed us, the compassion of those children outside, and the compassion that has always lived within our hearts." Doris turned her eyes to the window, her expression peaceful as she looked out at the vast blue sky stretching endlessly above them. "Compassion truly does have the power to overcome anything," she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. The story of Doris and Ernest didn't end in their small home. It extended far beyond their modest lives, becoming a symbol of kindness, resilience, and the enduring power of humanity. In a world increasingly dependent on technology and rigid rules, their story served as a poignant reminder. Compassion is the guiding light that can navigate even the most challenging circumstances. Through Tyrell's selfless actions and the community's overwhelming support, the Wellingtons reminded everyone that people don't exist to serve rules. Rules exist to serve people. Doris's unwavering love and sacrifice for Ernest, paired with Tyrell's courage to stand up for what was right, taught a profound lesson. Sometimes, the smallest actions can change a life, a community, or even the world. From seemingly ordinary moments, extraordinary impacts were born. Doris and Ernest's story highlighted that kindness, no matter how small, creates ripples that spread far and wide. In the face of adversity, they showed that prioritizing empathy and humanity can lead to monumental change. This story wasn't just about a couple or a bank, it was about a universal truth. In any situation, we all have the power to be bearers of hope. Even the simplest act of kindness can create a powerful ripple effect, reminding the world of the importance of compassion. If Doris, Ernest, and Tyrell's story has touched your heart, let it inspire you to spread kindness in your own way. Share this message with others to keep the ripple of compassion alive. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and inspiring stories like this one. Together, let's build a community where compassion is always prioritized. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.